Good morning and welcome as we continue together in our study of Proverbs, or where can wisdom be found? Today we're going to be looking together at chapter 10 in Mishle, and as is our custom, we'll read through in the Hebrew and the English, and then share some reflections in the commentary. So I'll ask everyone to join me in reading 5 verses from the text that we have. Okay, and we'll start with Goldie, with the first 5. Mishle Shlomo ben Chacham Yesamach Av uven Ksil Tugat Imo.
Proverbs of Solomon. A wise child gladdens his father, but a foolish child is his mother's sorrow.
Lo yo'ilu otzrot resha utzdaka tatzil mimavet.
Treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death.
Lo yariv Adonai nefesh tzadik vehavat reshaim yedof.
The Lord will not suffer the soul of the righteousness to famish, but rebuffs the desire of the wicked.
Ra'o shoseh kaf remiya v'yad charutzim ta'ashir.
A deceitful palm brings privation, but enriching is the hand of the diligent.
Oger b'kaitz ben maskil, nirdam b'katzir ben mevish.
A clever son gathers in summer, but a shameful son sleeps at harvest time.
Great. Marian, brachot rosh lerosh tzadik, ufi reshaim yechaseh chamas.
Blessings on the head of the devoted one, but outrage will cover the mouth of the wicked.
Zecher tzadik livracha v'shem reshaim yirkav.
The memory of the righteous shall be for a blessing, but the name of the wicked shall rot.
Chacham lev yikach mitzvot ve'evil sefatayim yilavet.
The wise of heart takes commands, but a prating fool shall fall.
Holech betom yelech betach u'ma'akesh torachav yivadea.
One who walks uprightly walks securely, but one who walks crooked shall be found out.
Koretz ein yiten atzevet ve'evil sefatayim yilavet.
One who winks with the eye causes sorrow, and a prating fool shall fall.
Great. Shirley, on 11, Makor Chaim Pitzadik Ufi Reshaim Yechaseh Hamas.
The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but violence will veil the mouth of the wicked.
Sinat Orer Medanim Ve'al Kol Pshaim Techaseh Ahava.
Hatred spurs up strife, but love covers up all transgressions.
Siftei Navon Timatze Chochma V'Shevet Legev Chaser Lev.
On the lips of the discerning one is wisdom found, but a rod is for the back of the senseless.
Chachamim Mitzpanu Da'at Upi Evil Mechita Krova.
The wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of the fool is an imminent ruin.
Hon Ashir Kiryatu Zo Mechitat Dalim Mereisham.
The wealth of the rich is their fortress city. The ruin of the poor is their poverty.
Great. Alan, 16. Pe'ulat Tzadik L'chaim Tvuat Rasha L'chatat.
The effort of the righteous is for life. The increase of the wicked is offense.
Orech L'chaim Shomer Musa Ozev Tochachot Mat'eh.
A path for life heeds reproof, but the one who forsakes rebuke leads astray.
Mechaseh Sina Siftei Shaker Umotzei Diba Hu Chesil.
The one who hides hatred has lying lips, and one who slanders is a fool.
Berov Dvarim Lo Yechdal Pasha V'choshech Tzvatav Maskil.
In the multitude of words, misdeed will not cease, but the shrewd one holds their tongue.
Kesef Nivchar L'shon Tzadik Lev Reshaim Kimat. Verse 20.
choice silver, the tongue of the righteous one, but the heart of the wicked is worthless.
Great. Morton, 21. Siftei tzadik yeru rabim ve'evilim b'chasad lev yamotu.
Lips of the righteous guide many, but the foolish die for want of understanding.
Birkat Adonai hi ta'ashir ve'lo yosif etzev ima.
The blessing of the Lord will enrich, and toil adds nothing thereto.
Kischok l'chsil asod zima ve'chochma la'ish tvuna.
Just as it is the sport to a fool to do foul, so wisdom of the discerning one.
Megorat rasha hi tevoenu ve'tavat tzadikim iten.
What the wicked dreads will come upon that person, and the desire of the righteous shall be granted.
Avor tsufa ve'ein rasha ve'tzadik yesod olam.
When the storm passes, the wicked is no more, but the righteous is an everlasting foundation.
Great. 26, Bev. Kachometz lashinayim uche'ashan le'einayim ken he'atzio lishlochav.
As vinegar to the teeth and as smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to them that send him.
Yirat Adonai tosif yamim u'shnot reshaim tiktzorna.
Reverence of the Lord lengthens one's days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened.
Tochelet tzadikim simcha v'tikvat reshaim toved.
Longing of the righteous is a joy, but the expectation of the wicked shall perish.
Ma'oz latom derech Adonai chita lefo'alei aven.
A stronghold for the upright, the Lord's way, but ruin to the workers of iniquity.
Okay, it looks like Roberta's not here. Marion, do you want to take for your mom? 30. Tzadik le'olam bal yimot u'reshaim lo yishkenu aretz.
The righteous shall never stumble, but the wicked shall not inhabit the earth.
Pi tzadik yanuv chochma u'lashon tapuchot tikaret.
The mouth of the righteous buds with wisdom, but a perverse tongue shall be cut off.
Siftei tzadik yed'un ratzon u'fi reshaim tapuchot.
The lips of the righteous will know to please, but the mouth of the wicked, perversity.
Okay, wonderful. There's a lot of really interesting verses in here. Overall, there's a couple that I want to review to just again look at the reception and their abiding anxiety of influence, meaning that they continue to resonate centuries and millennia after they have been spoken and written. A couple examples. You notice, for example, anything that is actually used in common parlance in any of these proverbs. They're all pretty much succinct one-liners, but do any of them, for example, strike you as something that you've heard before in contemporary parlance about Jewish life? Like, for example, look at verse 7. People will say upon someone who's passed, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. That's a common idiom, right? There's a few of them as well. So verse 7 has a whole history that we'll look at together. And then the other one that just jumped out at me, because again, you have to listen to these to hear the resonance. It doesn't always strike at the beginning. But there is another one as well that we're going to talk about, which is verse 25, Tzadik Yesod Olam. The righteous is an everlasting foundation, a very important verse throughout the world of Hasidism, and specifically a proof text that's used to really, in a sense, strengthen the power and authority of the righteous leader within a Hasidic community, and specifically within the court, to suggest that the tzaddik is in many ways in a mediation point, or in a point of being able to transfer and to channel blessing to the community. And of course, this is used and abused in different ways in our own day as well. And anything else that comes up that you notice or that you have questions about before we go into some of the pieces that I wanted to look at? I want to look specifically at one verse that has a very long and deep history of interpretation that's quite interesting. Morton, did you have your hand up? Yep.
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to share something about in verse 27. There's the expression "Erat Adonai,"
Mhm.
and I just wanted to, if you're interested, I could report on what I found out about Erat Adonai versus Erat Elohim.
Great. Okay, so you can see it's coming up again here, right? So
Yeah.
what did you notice in your diligent assignment for Avodat Bait, the difference in terms of the two columns? How many times does Yerat Adonai appear in scripture?
Erat Adonai comes up 14 times. Erat Elohim comes up 3 times. And then Erat Adonai, but spelled out, Aleph, Daled,
Mhm.
Nun Yod,
Mhm.
comes up once.
So what does that tell you? Did you look at the context to see where it emerges? How many times
Yes,
does it occur, Yerat Adonai occur in the wisdom literature?
it's almost always in the wisdom literature. It comes up under Psalms
Mhm.
3 times,
Mhm.
Proverbs 10 times,
Uh-huh.
and Erat Adonai spelled out Adonai comes up in Job,
Mhm.
and then the other place for Erat Adonai is in Isaiah.
Okay, so that is extremely helpful. And Yerat Elohim, we saw one of them was in the story of the midwives. One of them was in the story of Abraham and his encounter with Avimelech. And where's the third Yerat Elohim?
There is in Shmuel,
Okay. So
Samuel
what
2,
Samuel
and
2?
also, oh yeah, and I'm sorry, there's another one in Nehemiah. So there are 4, I guess.
Okay, great. So that's extremely helpful. Now, because you've done that work for us, Morton, what can we conclude from this preliminary investigation of the data you've collected around the references to Yerat Adonai and Yerat Elohim in Scripture? What are you noticing now that seems to be
Well,
emerging?
it's the later books, I would assume, that have Erat Adonai.
Mhm. Yerat Elohim
Um,
seems to be perhaps earlier. That's one
right.
important observation. What else are we noticing that relates to what we're studying? Because you said that it occurs at least 10 times in Proverbs. So this really shows that there's a huge influence, both in terms of um, the repetition of this word as a leitmotif throughout the book of Proverbs, and perhaps a sense of ingenuity or originality that comes from Proverbs that influences the way it's used in the rest of the Bible, right? So Psalms and Job are outliers, but if Proverbs is using this expression 10 times, then clearly there's something about the way that Proverbs is trying to teach about Yirat Adonai that really defines the project of Proverbs. So that's really actually quite important. And we're going to have to think about that again, as each time we encounter it, what are we learning about Yirah here? Right, last time in chapter 9, Tchilat Yirat Adonai Tchilat Chochma was the expression at the beginning of the program of wisdom of Chochma starts with Yirat Adonai. So this clearly is something that is quite unique to Proverbs and to the process of the formation and transmission of wisdom. Okay, good. Did anyone have an issue with the way that I translated verse 2 in the B section? So where not the first part where it says Lo yu'ilu otzrot resha, treasures of the wicked profit nothing, but in the second part, Utzdaka tatzil mimavet is also a very famous expression. Sometimes when people give tzedakah, in the act of giving it, especially if they're going through a harrowing experience, I don't know if you've ever had this experience before where either someone approaches you for tzedakah, or if you're in a liminal or dangerous moment, they say, give some tzedakah. Has that ever happened to you? Someone is sick, someone's terminally ill, there's something going on in your life, give some tzedakah. Have you ever had that, either that inclination or someone who's made that plea to you? Not recently?
No.
No? Okay. Well, Bev knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, Alan?
I just like to go back to the use of the word Elohim and Adonai.
Yeah.
I'm
What else did you
curious.
find?
Well, I found that Elohim was used in the form of a creator, and the word appears in Bereshit, that
Yes.
Elohim
As
created.
Yirat Elohim?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were modifying it. No.
Yeah, I have to modify it because otherwise, Alan, you're right. It becomes a much bigger question that I didn't want to go into, which
Okay.
is the much larger use and division of those terms of God, those names of God throughout Scripture. That's a huge other project that we're going
Okay.
to bracket for now.
Perfect.
But
Okay.
it's definitely a big issue, especially in terms of the documentary hypothesis and how we understand what those names mean and how they convey different realities of the divine as well as different communities' understanding of the divine. But we're going to bracket that. It's a different
Okay.
project. But thank you for paying attention to it. So I'm referring specifically to this word here, in verse 2. I translated it here on the pshat level as righteousness. But how do we understand the word in our own experience? Is it righteousness, or do we understand tzedakah as something else, or tzedakah?
We think of it as charity, don't we?
That's right. So we think of it as charity, Mary, and the question we have to begin to unpack is, why is it so much a knee-jerk reaction that whenever we hear the word tzedakah, we automatically think of charity as opposed to righteousness? If you look in Scripture, especially in Genesis and some of the other texts that describe it, often it speaks about justice or righteousness, but not about charity per se. So the charity component and this idea that righteousness delivers you from death is interesting but strange, but the treasures of wickedness profit nothing. It would seem that it could work both ways here, that if we're talking about otzrot and treasure, that if we're talking about a parallelism, that there's a reflection in the A part and the B part of the verse, then treasure, which you hoard if you're wicked, right, as opposed to the opposite, which would be charity that you share with others, seems to actually fit here, even if it doesn't necessarily fit the pshat according to many of the commentators and the translators in this regard. But what I want to do now, just for a moment, is I'd like to actually show you. I would like to actually show you. Sorry, the power of this specific verse within its rabbinic interpretation. So I'm trying to screen share with you now a fascinating section from the Talmud, and just let me know, does it come up now as 10:2, but righteousness from death? Deliverance from death?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I want to just share with you something. This comes from the context that we need to understand, that we learned from Steinsaltz, who's a great commentator on the Talmud. And this is the reason why in the rabbinic imagination, tzedakah shifts from righteousness to charity. And I'm going to share with you an extended tale in the Talmud that may explain why it is that we think this way. But there needs to be some context about the rabbinic mind in terms of how it related to the knowledge of the constellations. And I'm going to bring this all back in a moment to tzedakah, but you have to bear with me for a moment to understand how tzedakah is related to mazal. What is mazal? When you say to somebody mazel tov, what do you think that means?
Good fortune.
Good fortune. Good fortune.
Right, but usually you say mazel tov, you mean congratulations, right?
Or good
You
luck.
say that? Good luck, but we say it, we don't think so much about the fortune part of it, nor do we at all think about how astrology, which was a serious science in Babylonia, what the rabbis were very aware of, that was known as Itzdagnud in the Talmud, how it affects the way that we have an expression like Mazal Tov. So there is a lot of discussion of how the constellations do or do not control the Jewish people. And oftentimes there are qualities ascribed to astrological signs that actually relate to the visible qualities of the stars themselves, attributes of the sun and the moon, For example, if you're born under the sign of Venus, you have certain qualities that we'll take a look at here that are described in great detail. And in this section of the Talmud that I want to look at is a fascinating description of the import and the effect that constellations have or do not have on our fate or our destiny, and specifically whether or not righteous acts like tzedakah have the ability to be able to overturn what is preordained in the stars. So that's the issue at stake. Are you with me? Now take a look at this fascinating passage. It comes from Shabbat 156a and b, and we'll go around together and everybody can read a paragraph. It's on the screen share. Hopefully you can see it. It's really quite fascinating to see that this actually exists in the Talmud. Not only does the Talmud have a book of what we would call dream interpretation, but it also has its own little section on astrology. So let's go around the Zoom room together and we'll read this section. It starts with constellations and what does it mean to be born under a specific constellation. And from there, in the same discussion, it goes right into the larger question of whether or not charity, acts of tzedakah, allow you to overturn or to overcome what we would call today the severity of the decree, which we hear resonating in what language of which liturgy?
Yom Kippur.
That's right. The truth is we haven't escaped this. It's just taking on different forms, but the influence is deep. So let's start together. Do you want to start, Goldie? And just so you know, the way that I'm translating it here is that the bold is the actual Talmudic text, and what's not bolded is actually the just filling in the blank, because Talmud is a bit elliptic and you have to kind of fill in some of the blanks through intercalations. So that's what I've done here in adapting it. So Goldie, we'll each read a paragraph. We'll go around together and see. If you know what sign you were born under, you'll see what the rabbis say about your astrological sign. Everybody get your sign ready. Here we go. It's going to be interesting, okay? So Goldie, you with us? Or did we lose you? Goldie, I think you're on mute. Goldie, if you can unmute. We're going to start with Rabbi Hanina said to his students. Are you there? All right, let's go on to Marian. Marian will come back to Goldie. Rabbi Hanina.
Rabbi Hanina said to his students who heard all this, "Go and tell the son of Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, it's not the constellation of the day of the week that determines a person's nature. Rather, it is the constellation of the hour that determines his nature."
Okay, Shirley.
One who was born under the influence of the sun will be a radiant person. He will eat from his own resources and drink from his own resources, and his secrets will be exposed. If he steals, he will not succeed, because he will be like the sun that shines and is revealed to all.
Okay, excellent. Roberta, do you want to join us? Can you see on the screen share? You have to unmute though, please. Now we're on to Venus. Okay, you're still on mute. Alan, do you want to take over?
Sure. One who was born under the influence of Venus will be a rich and promiscuous person. What is the reason for this? Because fire was born during the hour of Venus. He will be subject the fire of the evil inclination, which burns perpetually.
Good. Take the next one as well, Alan, for Mercury.
One who was born under the influence of Mercury will be an enlightened and expert man, because Mercury is the sun's scribe, as it is closest to the sun.
Good. Okay. Morton, the moon.
He's finding the print a little small. I'll read.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay. One who was born under the influence of the moon will be a man who suffers pains, who builds and destroys and builds. He will be a man who eats not from his own resources and drinks not from his own resources, and whose secrets are hidden. If he steals, he will succeed, as he is like the moon that constantly changes form, whose light is not its own, and who is at times exposed and at times hidden.
Okay, and maybe Saturn as well. Bev, keep going.
One who was born under the influence of Saturn will be a man whose thoughts are for naught. And some say that everything others think about him and plan to do to him is for naught.
Okay, interesting. Roberta, are you unmuted now? No, you're still muted. Okay. Let's now go on to Jupiter. Goldie, are you able to read? Unmuted?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Oh, okay.
Jupiter.
Jupiter. One who was born under the influence of Jupiter, Tzedek, will be a just person, Tzadkan. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, and just in this context means just in the performance of mitzvot.
Okay. Shirley, now let's go to Mars.
One who was born under the influence of Mars will be one who spills blood. Rav Ashi said he will be either a bloodletter or a thief or a slaughterer of animals or a circumciser. Rabbi said, I was born under the influence of Mars and I do not perform any of those activities. Abaya said, my master also punishes and kills as a judge.
Okay, so this is the first section. It's really quite wild to imagine that you would find this in a rabbinic text. You should probably be a little bit surprised, but it's a fascinating text that shows us how aware the rabbis were in the rabbinic period, specifically between the 3rd and 6th century CE in the Sasanian culture of Persia, how influenced they were and how aware they were of astrology, both in Babylonia as well as in Palestine of Eretz Israel. So now the larger question is why does this matter to us in relationship to tzedakah? We're going to get there. Just you have to be patient. Now let's go a little further. Marian, let's see what Rabbi Hanina says about here. The constellation is a constellation. The word for constellation is a mazal. Okay. So go ahead. Oops, sorry. I apologize. 1 second. Let me take us back to where we were. Oh, okay, here we are. There we go.
It is stated that Rabbi Hanina says, a constellation makes one wise and a constellation makes one wealthy. And there is a constellation for the Jewish people that influences them. Rabbi Yohanan said, there is no constellation for the Jewish people that influences them. The Jewish people are not subject to the influence of astrology.
So let's just stop there for a second. So there's a debate now between the rabbis who know about astrology, but what's the issue about the influence of Mazal? Why would they be arguing over this if it was considered to be as quote unquote the science of the day? Why is it bothering the rabbis? Why is there so much disagreement here? Morton?
Because it flies in the face of the notion of free will.
Say more. So just state what's
if there's no free will, then one is essentially not responsible for one's actions.
So I could open up my daily horoscope by the hour, by the day, look at what the astrological sign says, and if it says, for example, I'm supposed to be a bloodletter and kill someone, and God forbid I was to go to do that, then I would no longer be responsible, because in court I would say, well, it's not me. That's what my sign, my constellation says I was supposed to do. I'm just fulfilling my destiny, or that's my fate, right? So is that part of what you're saying?
That's right, exactly.
Okay. So, and why is that a problem for Jews and for Rabbinic Judaism? Because the inverse is that Rabbinic Judaism privileges or prioritizes the importance of what?
Of choice.
Right. Right. Not just choice, but free will.
Of doing the right thing.
Well, we're going to get to the right thing. That's the element of tzedakah. You're right. But the issue of free will, right? Remember Rabbi Akiva says, 1 second, Alan. Rabbi Akiva says in Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah, which is 2nd century CE, a little earlier, he says, Hakol tzapui v'harashut netuna. What does that mean? He's saying something very interesting, which speaks to the tension of what the rabbis are arguing about here. He says everything is preordained. So now, Morton, if we go back to what you said earlier, if everything is preordained by God and or by reading the constellations, then what does that imply?
That
For
people
me as a
don't-
person, or for you?
that there isn't really a choice.
That's right. There's no free will. Okay. If everything is preordained, which means that it's what we would call in theological terms that there's strong omniscience. God knows everything, and therefore because God knows everything and God is true and the knowledge is true, then by the act of God knowing it, it compels that truth to come into existence, and I have no free will to change it. It's written in the book of life, let's say, and once it's written down, Aubrey is going to go and at 3 o'clock and shovel the snow in front of his walkway. Then that's it. I have no choice. That's called strong omniscience. Okay. Now, the rest of Akiva's sentence, though, is intriguing because he says the ve harashut netuna. And I'm not going to translate the ve yet because we're going to have to see after we finish this what it actually means. What can ve, the vav, mean in Hebrew?
The
And
Right. So depending on the context, the vav can mean either and or but or since. It depends on the context. So here, Rabbi Akiva says, in an interesting way, that everything is preordained. Ve, ve, ha reshut netuna, and free will is given, or but free will is given. Depends on how you understand his approach, and we'll see. We may encounter Rabbi Akiva here in a moment as we go through it. But just keep that in mind. What's at stake is that if you hold that there is strong omniscience, that God knows everything that's written in a book, and whatever is written because it's true, in a sense, means that I am obligated to fulfill whatever that task or duty is because of the power of God's omniscience and its truth, then I have no free will. On the other hand, if I'm completely free, then how can there be any omniscience? Right? It weakens the sense of omniscience. So it's a paradox. And it's something that the medieval Jewish philosophers, Muslim and Christian philosophers argue about incessantly. We're going to bracket it for now because we're concerned with biblical Judaism. But this rabbinic period that is influenced is very interesting to see early on how it's struggling with the notion of free will and God's knowledge and what that means for us as human beings. Look at the way that they continue and look at what's at stake when they say there is no constellation that influences the Jewish people. Right? So let's go a little bit further. L'Yisrael ein mazal. And in Jewish history, that could also mean that the Jews just don't have mazel, which means, look at Jewish history. It's known as the lachrymose version of Jewish history. You know, they, how does it go? As the little idiom, we say, they attacked us, we survived, let's eat.
Yeah.
So in the end of the day, that's what Jewish history is. It's one attack after another. We survive and then we eat. So that means that as a certain level of humor, black humor for survival is to say, well, what do you want to do? We don't have much muzzle. Just we are who we are, right? As Tevye would say, couldn't you have chosen someone else? Right? Chosenness is being chosen to suffer. We have no muzzle, right? That's kind of the Yiddish humor approach that Tevye would take. Let's see what the rabbis do here to go a little further. So I interrupted Marion in the middle there, but just go back to Rabbi Yochanan's statement, who actually counters what Rabbi Chanina says. Rabbi Yochanan says there is no mazal for the Jewish people insofar as any mazal that would influence them. These are a free-willed people. Okay, they're not subject to the influence of astrology like other communities are, whether it's the world of in the Greek world, the Egyptian world, in Mesopotamia, whatever it is, who follow in Persia, who follow very closely the astrological signs, and their people are influenced by it, not the Jewish people. Shirley?
Well, it's just, it speaks to like a pagan, as you were saying, Rabbi, like a pagan understanding, and that other gods were involved in constellations, as you can see just in the naming of the constellations. So that would be an antithesis to what we believe in, and that there's one God. And I never understood, like, you see the mosaic tiles in
The Beit Alpha synagogue. So what are they doing there?
yeah, so I've never understood that piece with
Does
the,
everybody know what Shirley's talking about? If you go into northern Israel and the Galilee, they've
Yeah.
uncovered a number of stunning multicolored mosaic tiles on the floors of early synagogues there, which were on the floor of these synagogues, and they were called the Galgal Hamazalot, the zodiac wheel of all, or what we would call the wheel of fortune, of all the different constellations of the 12 signs on the floor of a synagogue. So as Shirley says today, as a modern Jew, this is heresy. It's the height of heresy. How could you put an astrological zodiac sign inside the synagogue on the floor? But we're using modern eyes to look at an ancient phenomenon. In the ancient world, while it may have been a pagan belief, it was common religious science of the time, and the rabbis knew this well, and that's why they put it into the Talmud, because it was part of the wisdom they shared. We're talking about wisdom, right? And the question is, how do you square this kind of religious wisdom of your time with being a monotheistic people? So they're struggling with that because they know they have to be able to understand the way that this science works, because that was considered to be part of the wisdom of the time, but they're troubled by it. And so we're kind of taking a window in to the evolution of Judaism and the shift that is already underway in the Bible that we've spoken about in the Hebrew Bible. That is the shift between living in a pagan world of polytheism, where there are many gods with many powers over many domains, and the shift that Abraham and Sarah in the Ur of the Chaldees, which was a place that was considered to be in the Fertile Crescent of the Levant, a very sophisticated polytheistic culture. They break with that culture, and Abraham and Sarah discover through their journey the one God, who is also referred to, as we spoke about earlier, as in his journeys as El Elyon, El, the most supernal of all deities, right? The ultimate one who rules over the pantheon of the other gods or of the other constellations. So this would not have disturbed the ancients. It's starting to bother the rabbis a little bit, but in ancient Israel, this would not have been really much of a problem. Yeah, Morton?
Is that one of the reasons why there's this sprinkling of Irat Adonai in Proverbs? It's to put the imprimatur of the Jewish God on what was probably a generally held wisdom literature?
I think you're onto something. That's part of what I want us to think about, is why would it occur 10 times in one book? Makes you ask the question. It's a very good question, that this is now the Israelite religion par excellence, and this is the shift from pagan culture and polytheism to monolatry, where there is an El Elyon throughout the book of Genesis, and even in some of the wisdom texts like Job and in Psalms. And so, as you aptly put it, this is the imprimatur of an Israelite religion that is trying to distinguish itself. And it's not enough to say Yirat Elohim, which it could have said, but it's Yirat Adonai, which is a tribal name of God. And this is a way of saying there's something different happening now that leads to this sense of peoplehood, right? And I think it's really an important thing for us to keep thinking about. But you put it well, there's the imprimatur of something distinct or unique, a project that's beginning to emerge, that by the time we reach the rabbis in the Talmud here, it's clear that they have a certain anxiety, because their anxiety is in relationship to Greek and Roman culture, right? And how the Jewish people that are emerging, even though they may not have sovereign power, have an emerging sense of identity that is their peoplehood. So that's very important. Let's go a little further. I want to go just to the end of this, because I haven't gotten to the proof text yet. This was all the prelude, but let's get to the good part here. All right, so Marian, do you want to continue? I interrupted you halfway through. Rabbi Yochanan follows his own reasoning.
And Rabbi Yochanan follows his own reasoning, as Rabbi Yochanan said, from where is it derived that there is no constellation for the Jewish people?
Right? For Israel, Ein Mazal. Where do we know that from?
As
Keep
it is
going.
stated, thus said the Lord, learn not the way of the nations, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the nations are dismayed at them. The nations will be dismayed by them, but not the Jewish people.
Right? So that is to say that Jeremiah here is a prophetic critique of these signs, of these simanim, of these otot that come from the heavens. They will ultimately be their downfall, but not the Jewish people. Okay, Marion, go a little bit further for us, the next paragraph, please. What does Rav say?
And Rav also holds that there is no constellation for the Jewish people, as Rav Yehuda said that Rav said. From where is it derived that there is no constellation for the Jewish people, as it is stated with regard to Abraham? And he brought him outside and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said unto him, so shall your offspring be. The sages derived from this that Abraham said before the Blessed Holy One, Master of the universe, behold, you have given me no offspring, and one born in my house is to be my heir. And one born in my house is to be my heir. The Blessed Holy One said to him, no. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man shall not be your heir, rather one that will come forth from your own innards shall be your heir.
So this is interesting now. We go back to the story of Abraham, and the sages are trying to, in a sense, reconstruct this this history of the way that Judaism is evolving, and they read it through their own lens. But Abraham, at least already in rabbinic understanding, already is looking at the stars. Maimonides later on actually says that Abraham was a philosopher and who knew astrology well. That was something in Maimonides' time in the medieval period was actually important to know. But he was a philosopher who knew the deeper science of astrology. So Abraham is struggling with this, and now look at what it says. This is where it gets interesting. Alan, do you want to read? What does Abraham say back to God now?
Abraham said before him, Master of the universe, I looked at my astrological map, and according to the configuration of my constellations, I am not fit to have a son. The Blessed Holy One said to him, emerge from your astrology, as the verse states, and he brought him outside, as there is no constellation for Israel. What is your thinking?
Did you see what's going on here? Abraham is arguing with God in a very different way than we're used to him arguing. He's not arguing for justice, but he's saying, I looked at God, I looked at my horoscope, and it doesn't look like Isaac is in the cards. Okay, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to have a son, so we're going to forget it. And what does God say back to Abraham? Put away your horoscope. If you believe that, Nourishkeit, you're never going to achieve anything, especially have a child in your old age. I'm going to show you otherwise. So it's this interesting inner dialogue that that goes on. And now it takes it one step further and suggests that the ancients, including the Israelites, would look at their constellations for issues of mazel, which include fertility. Okay, so we see how important this becomes. Shirley, do you want to read for us a bit? What does Jupiter have to do with it?
It is because Jupiter is situated in the west that you cannot have children.
Right, it's a question. Is it because Jupiter is situated in the west that you cannot have children?
Okay.
Right, this is now God challenging Abraham's reading of his astrology. So God is a great astrologer. God really knows how to read it, but Abraham, you're misreading it. Keep going.
I will restore it and establish it in the east. And that is the meaning of that which is written with regard to Abraham, who has raised up one from the east. He will call justice and his steps.
Right, he will call tzedek leraglo, justice to his steps. Keep going. This is the verse from Isaiah that proves God's point.
He gives nations before him and makes him rule over kings. His sword makes them as the dust, his bow as the driven stubble, from Isaiah. And God established tzedek in the east on behalf of Abraham.
God is now saying that, and in a sense, we know the way the story ends is that eventually there will be a fertile there will be fertility in their family, but God has to shift the constellations in order to accommodate Abraham and Sarah, which is fascinating. And now let's keep going. Alan, do you want to read for us? And
Yes.
from that which transpired?
And from that which transpired to Shmuel, one can also conclude that there is no constellation for the Jewish people. The Gemara.
Okay, so now we're going to shift from Abraham. We're jumping forward to a story that Shmuel is going to tell about Rabbi Akiva and his daughter, which this is the whole point of what I wanted to show you, which is I want you to pay attention to the way that the verse tzedakah tatzil mimavet, that charity saves you from death. This is a fascinating tale to explain why it is that we have this this abiding belief that even in contemporary Jewish life, that when you're facing danger, give tzedakah. It's a fascinating story. Okay, so Alan, go for it.
The Gemara relates that Shmuel and the Gentile sage Ablet were sitting and they saw these people were going to the lake. Ablet said to Shmuel, "This person will go and he will not return because a snake will bite him and he will die." Shmuel said to him, "If he is a Jew, he will go and come back." As they were sitting for a while, the person they discussed went away and then returned.
Okay, so I misspoke. We're going to get to Rabbi Akiva's daughter, but here this is a debate between Shmuel and a Gentile sage, probably who was an astrologer. And they're debating what's going to happen specifically with when they encounter a snake, and whether or not someone who is Jewish or not Jewish is going to be prone to being bitten and will die from this snake bite or not. Let's see what happens. So the claim that Shmuel makes, which presupposes what? That if you're a Jew and you go and you come back and you'll be bitten and you won't die, what does that mean? What is Shmuel? What's the underlying assumption of Shmuel here?
That God's protecting you.
That's right, that you have mazal. Otherwise, if you don't have mazal, then sorry, folks, but the snake bite will kill you. Okay, there was no vaccine for snake bites back then. Okay, so now what happens? Marion, why don't you continue? Ablet.
Ablet stood up, threw down the person's burden, and inside he found a snake cut and cast in 2 pieces. Shmuel said to him, "What did you do to merit being saved from death?" The person said to him, "Every day we all take bread together and eat from the bread. Today there was one of us who did not have bread. And when it came time to gather the bread, he was embarrassed because he did not have any to give. I said to the others, 'I will go and take the bread.' When I came to the person who did not have bread, I rendered myself as one who was taking from him so that he would not be embarrassed." Shmuel said to him, "You performed a mitzvah." Shmuel went out and taught based on this incident that even though it is written, "And charity will save from death," it does not only mean that it will save a person from an unusual death, but even from death itself.
So what's going on here in this story? This is a very interesting way to read this verse. What happens with the story of Avlet, and what does Shmuel seem to imply is going on? Remember, Avlet is a Gentile sage, so he's not obligated in any of the rabbinic mitzvot, including tzedakah. So what's going on here? Who can just sort of recap and explain what happened?
So Shmuel's saying, if I approach someone who has nothing to give, I will pretend that I'm taking from him so as to avoid his being embarrassed that he had nothing to give. So I will cover his embarrassment.
Right.
That's, in fact, my mitzvah, that I have not let him be shamed in public.
So that's the way Shmuel is interpreting what Avlet did.
Right.
Right, he's interpreting it. Shmuel didn't do it. Shmuel is saying, you, a Gentile who's not obligated in the mitzvot, you saved someone from shame, as you said, Bev. And that is what ultimately is what saves you from not just from an unusual death, but from death itself, because you were charitable and you were able to to restore or to protect someone's dignity who was in need. So it's a very interesting series of strange events that are going on, because it really should be the rabbi who's doing this, but it's not. It's the Gentile sage, and Shmuel is learning from the Gentile sage what it means to be charitable and to preserve someone's dignity. And then he says, now I understand what it says in scripture. It's tzedakah tatzil mimavet. It doesn't mean that you will just preserve someone from an unusual death, but from death itself. Because here, it wasn't about the snake. It was actually about sharing bread, being hungry, right? So do you see the way that the way the story is being told and how the verse is used in this first instance?
Right.
Okay, so now that's Avlet and Shmuel. And now we get to Rabbi Akiva, who we spoke about earlier, and at his daughter's wedding. Right, so Shirley, do you want to read for us, please?
And from that which transpired to Rabbi Akiva as well, it can be derived that there is no consolation for the Jewish people, as Rabbi Akiva had a daughter, and Chaldean astrologers told him that on the same day that she enters the wedding canopy, a snake will bite her and she will die. She was very worried about this.
Right, so hold on a second. Imagine that you're getting a wedding together for your daughter, and you're doing all the wedding planning and all the things that are important to get a wedding ready, between the flower arrangements, and you're worrying about the color of the napkins and the seating arrangements and all the things that you have to do to prepare for a wedding. How many of you, in the process of doing that, either for your own wedding or specifically for your child's wedding, made time to go to see the astrologer before the date? Does anyone do that?
No.
Nope.
It's amazing. This was part of wedding planning in antiquity. Of course you would go to the astrologer. That's just your wedding planner would say, and when are you going to see the astrologer? So they went to see the astrologer, and now the Chaldean astrologers told Rabbi Akiva that apparently was what the men would have to do. The women would do the other planning. Men would go to see the astrologer, that she's going to enter the chuppah, a snake would bite her and she would die. What kind of a wedding is there to plan for? It sounds like you're planning for a wedding and a funeral.
Funeral.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So a lot of anxiety. So Rabbi Akiva then goes and tells his daughter, honey, this is what's going to happen to you under the chuppah. I just wanted to let you know. No pressure. Relax and enjoy, right? So keep going, Shirley. What happens? What does she do?
On that day, her wedding day, she took the ornamental pin from her hair and stuck it into a hole in the wall for safekeeping. And it happened that it entered directly into the eye of the snake. In the morning, when she took the pin, the snake was pulled and came out with it.
Okay, it's going to end in a moment here. Alan, do you want to finish? What did her father, Rabbi Akiva, say to his daughter?
Her father, Rabbi Akiva, said to her, "What did you do to merit being saved from the snake?" She told him, "In the evening, a poor person came and knocked on the door, and everyone was preoccupied with the feast, and nobody heard him. I stood and took the portion that you gave me and gave it to him." Rabbi Akiva said to her, "You performed the mitzvah, and you were saved in its merit." Rabbi Akiva went out and taught based on this incident that even though it is written, "And charity will save from death," it does not mean that it will save a person only from an unusual death, but even from death itself.
So now it's an interesting inversion, right? Rabbi Akiva wants to understand, how did his daughter manage to survive what the astrologers were saying was going to happen? What did she do that relates back to the story of Avlet and Shmuel now being performed by a Jewess? What does she do?
She gives something to this poor person and
Right,
gives in charity.
She listens to the cry of the poor person. This apparently seems like it may have been, like the rehearsal dinner, right? They're having a smorgasbord, and there was a schlepper on, begging, a bettler who was begging, and no one was listening because they were just too focused on the feast. But she heard the cry of the person in distress, and what did she do? This is the bride. She hears the cry, and she goes out to give him, or invites him in to have something to eat. And Rabbi Akiva says, just like Shmuel and Avlet learned, tzedakah tatzil mimavet means charity will save you from death. not just from an unusual death, but from death itself. Okay, so let's finish with one final story. There's three of them that come together, and they're all fascinating tales here, but let's finish with this one. Bev, do you want to read it? Can you see it? About
Yeah.
Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak?
Okay, and from that which transpired to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak as well, it can be derived that there is no consolation for the Jewish people. As Chaldean astrologers told Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's mother, your son will be a thief.
So,
She did
of
not-
course, that's what every Jewish mother loves to hear, right? You go to the astrologer, your son's going to be a thief. He's going to be a ganef.
Right. She did not allow him to uncover his head. She said to her son, cover your head so that the fear of heaven will be upon you, and pray for divine mercy. He did not know why she said this to him. One day he was sitting and studying beneath a palm tree that did not belong to him, and the cloak fell off his head. He lifted his eyes and saw the palm tree. He was overcome by impulse, and he climbed up and detached a bunch of dates with his teeth. Apparently, he had an inborn inclination to steal, but he was able to overcome that inclination with proper education and prayer.
Okay, and so this is actually an example where the rabbis are shifting Yirat Adonai to what is Nachman bar Yitzchak's mother trying to inculcate in him, not Yirat Adonai, but what is known here in the rabbinic terms that is really inspired by Proverbs actually is Yirat Shamayim.
Mhm.
And so how does she want him to preclude his wiring according to the astrological signs is that he was born under a sign. If you go back and look, the sign that would predispose him to be a thief. And so what does she do to try to overcome that?
Education and prayer.
Right. She wants him to become basically the model of a pious rabbinic Jew. She wants him to become pious. And the rabbis love this verse, not only of Tzedakah Tatil Mimavet, but also here, Reshit Adonai, Reshit Chochma Yirat Adonai. She understands and puts into place here in this final story that the beginning of wisdom is reverence of the divine. And how is he supposed to be engaged in proper education and prayer? By doing what?
Study.
But it's not just studying though. How is he studying it? Under the tree. He's covering his head.
Yeah.
Okay, so the sign of rabbinic piety here, when under three circumstances, when is one supposed to cover their head to show Yirat Shamayim, to model the sense of piety, when doing three things that he's engaged in, or at least that are implied here. When you're studying Torah, cover your head. When you're eating, he goes to get the dates, cover your head, and also in prayer. So this is the way that Nachman bar Yitzchak's mother overcomes his predisposition, according to the sign, to be a thief. He becomes pious, and we see this elsewhere in rabbinic lore. For example, Rabbi Yochanan as well was a brigand who eventually becomes one of the greatest sages of Israel because he adapts this rabbinic project of piety that really finds its beginning in the book of Proverbs. So what I've tried to show today is both based on a verse that Morton looked at and reminded us that we see here in chapter 10, as well as back in chapter 9, that Yirat Adonai, this reverence of the divine in our lives, is a key component to practicing wisdom. And that wisdom translates into rabbinic piety, as we see in the section in the Talmud. And more importantly, there's a transformation between righteousness and justice and the act of giving charity, which becomes a very important part of rabbinic piety that also exists in biblical religion, right? We know in terms of leaving the field for the gleaners and for the tithing, all the things that are required in biblical religion. Now, in the shift from agrarian society to a market-based economy, it's more about opening your door, opening your heart, making space at your table, or giving someone the ability to break bread with you, which is not about necessarily leaving space for the gleaners in the fields, because we're no longer talking about agrarian society and its forms of charity. So that's the reason why the rabbis really find this verse to be so important. And there were 3 stories that we learned to illustrate how they are understanding and carrying forward the impulse to give charity, and how it serves as a kind of prophylactic. The constellations won't save you, is what they're saying, right? But if you act with free will and you fulfill the mitzvah of being charitable, that is not only the key to a meaningful life, but it also saves you from an unusual death or from death itself. And so, in a sense, it imbues you with a certain kind of spiritual power. And we saw that in the story of Reb Nachman Bar Yitzchak and his mother, Rabbi Akiva and his daughter. And it began with the story of Shmuel and Avlet, which are 3 Talmudic tales that in many ways are really quite inspiring, quite fantastical, and they get our attention, and they give us something to think about. So for next time together, we'll think more about how acts of tzedakah are empowering and also life-giving forces to act as a prophylactic against any sense of danger in our lives. So I wanted to thank everybody for a great session today, and we'll see you next week for
Yes,